A 10-year-old girl walked into the hospital with an infant in her arms, and what she told the doctors turned their world upside down. The night was unusually cold, even for November. The empty hospital corridor was illuminated by fluorescent lights that emitted an unpleasant hum. The staff was preparing for a good night until the front door opened. A girl appeared on the threshold, barefoot, wearing a dirty coat that was clearly too big for her, and carrying an infant in her arms. She didn't say a word, but her appearance made everyone freeze. The girl was not even 10 years old, but there was a maturity in her gaze that sent shivers down her spine. Her eyes with a slight shadow of despair, her dirty blonde hair out of a ponytail, and a black eye told that she had been through something terrible. Nurse Angela, seeing the girl, rushed over to her. "Honey, are you okay? What happened?" Her voice was shaking. The girl silently raised her hands, in which she held the baby wrapped in an old, torn blanket. She said nothing, only whispered, "Help him." Angela gently took the baby, feeling her own hands shaking. His little face was pale, his lips blue. He seemed to be on the verge of life and death. "Who is it?" "Your brother?" she asked. The girl nodded, her lips trembling. "What's his name?" Angela continued, trying to keep the connection. The girl lowered her eyes. "Raoul. He's very small." Angela nodded to the other medics to get the equipment ready to examine the infant. Meanwhile, Dr. Emilio approached the girl. He had to get down on one knee so that their eyes met at the same level. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked softly. "Lucia," the girl replied, her voice barely audible. "Lucia, where is your mom? Why did you come alone?" he continued, trying to speak as gently as possible. Lucia looked away, her shoulders trembling. She bit her lip, as if hesitating to say something important. Finally, after a pause, she spoke. "She's gone." Those 3 words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The doctor tried to calm the girl, but her face remained frozen, as if she did not want to let her emotions out. Raoul was taken away to be examined and Lucia was escorted to one of the empty rooms to keep her warm and find out what had happened. She sat down on the couch with her legs tucked up and her arms wrapped around herself. "Did you carry him here alone?" Angela asked, handing her a cup of warm tea. "Yes," Lucia nodded. "I couldn't leave him." "Where did you come from? Is it far away?" The girl froze for a second, her eyes running around the room as if she was afraid to say something. "From home. He stayed there." Her voice trembled, but she quickly pulled herself together. "Who stayed, Lucia?" Angela asked softly. "Father," the girl answered so quietly that she could barely be heard. "But he won't be looking for us anymore." The words made Angela shudder inwardly. Dr. Emilio, standing at the door, looked at Angela. Something about this girl said that there was more behind her silence than they were ready to hear. The doctor carefully stepped closer. "Lucia, it's not your fault what happened. But we need to know so we can help you and Raoul." The girl looked at him with her big eyes. She began, but stopped. At that moment the door of the room opened and a nurse said quietly, "Doctor, the infant is in stable serious condition. We need to talk." Emilio walked out, leaving Angela with Lucia. The girl shut down again, as if her power had disappeared with the doctor. Outside, Emilio listened to the report on the infant's condition while Lucia sat with her head down. Something in her demeanor said she hadn't just come here to get help for her brother. Dr. Emilio closed the room door behind him as he heard Lucia's last words, "He's not just my brother." Those words pounded in his head, but he pushed them away, focusing on the nurse's report. "Doctor, the infant's condition is extremely unstable. His body temperature is critically low, signs of severe dehydration and exhaustion. But strangest of all, his body shows signs of old injuries. Lacerations on his arms, as if they'd been bound." Emilio frowned. "Call the police," he said firmly. The nurse nodded and left, leaving the doctor standing in the middle of the hallway. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Lucia was here, alone, with an infant in her arms. Too many questions, and not one answer. He returned to the room. The girl was sitting on the bed, straddling his lap. Her face was frozen with an expression of the kind of pain a child shouldn't feel. Angela sat beside her, quietly stroking her shoulder. "Lucia," Emilio began, sitting down in the chair across from her. "Raúl is in good hands now. We'll do everything we can to make him well. But to help you both, I need to know what happened." Lucia lowered her eyes, her shoulders shaking slightly. "If I tell Dash," she hesitated, as if the words were stuck in her throat. "Would you tell the police?" Angela and Emilio looked at each other. "We want to protect you and Raúl," the doctor said softly. "But to do that, we need to understand everything that happened." The girl was silent for a long time, then she exhaled and looked up. "He hated me," she said, and the words came out as quietly as if she was afraid someone would hear them. "From the beginning." "Who?" Angela asked, holding Lucia's hand. "Father," she said. Those words were the starting point for a story that slowly, like raindrops, began to erode the facade of mystery that surrounded Lucia. Lucia began by saying that her mother had died when she was only 4 years old. She barely remembered her except for the smell of jasmine that always lingered in the house and the quiet songs her mother sang before bed. After her death, everything changed. Her father, Javier, had become a different man. He barely spoke to Lucia, only yelling when she made noise or didn't follow his commands. As she grew older, she learned to fear his footsteps, the sound of his voice. When Lucia turned 8, her father brought a baby boy, Raúl, into the house. "He said he was my brother," she said, clenching her hands into fists. "But he never called him by his first name. Only it." Raúl had been weak from the beginning. The baby would cry at night, and his father, instead of soothing him, could just toss a pillow into his crib to shut him up. Lucia didn't understand why Raúl was in their house. She had never seen her father treat him like a son. "What about your mother?" Angela asked. The girl looked at her, as if for the first time she realized that adults could be so ignorant. "She would never have let him do that to us," Lucia said. "But she's long gone." Angela frowned. "Where did Raúl come from?" Emilio asked. Lucia hesitated. I don't know. Dad just brought him over one day. Said we would take care of him now." Those words made Angela feel a cold lump in her stomach. Lucia continued to tell how her life was becoming a nightmare with each passing day. Her father forced her to do housework, threatening her with punishments if anything was done wrong. She cooked, cleaned and tried to keep Raúl away from him. The girl's voice trailed off. "He said I should have died instead of Mom." Emilio felt his palms clench into fists. "Why did you decide to leave?" he asked cautiously. Because she took a deep breath. Because he said he was going to turn Raoul in. The words sounded so harsh that even an experienced doctor felt a chill run down his spine. Turn him in where? Angela asked, but her voice was already filled with fear of the answer. He'd said that this place would take him in gladly. That they loved children who were no good to anyone. Those words brought a sense of dread to Angela's mind. She didn't know what Lucia meant by the place, but clearly nothing good. Dr. Emilio left Angela with the girl, going to the ward where the infant was. He stood in front of the incubator, watching the tiny body hooked up to the machines. There were indeed signs of rough treatment on his hands. "We've taken the tests," the nurse said as she entered the room. "No congenital diseases, just signs of exhaustion. But there is something strange." "What?" Emilio asked. "His DNA doesn't match the alleged father." Those words were like a hammer smashing through a fragile wall of logic. "It's impossible," he said, almost in a whisper. "We've checked twice. He's not related to either his father or Lucia." Emilio looked at the infant, and he had the feeling that he was just beginning to unravel the tangle of this dark story. A couple hours later, detectives arrived at the hospital. They listened carefully to Lucia's story, asking questions, writing down her words. However, even their experience did not help. The girl's story was too strange. When they asked about what had happened to her father, Lucia lowered her eyes and said, "He will never find us again." It wasn't just an answer, it was a statement. "What do you mean by that?" the detective asked. The girl raised her head, and something flashed in her eyes for a moment that made the man freeze. "He can't hurt anyone else," she said with icy certainty. All day long, the hospital felt the weight of what Lucia had brought with her. The nursing staff whispered, trying to unravel what was behind the girl's words and the infant's strange condition. The police continued to work, but the deeper the detectives dug into the story, the more questions arose. Lucia sat in the small patient room, clutching a cup of warm tea in her hands. Her gaze was blank, as if she were watching something distant and frightening. Angela stayed with her, trying to create a safe space. "Lucia," she said softly. "You didn't just end up here for no reason. You chose to come to the hospital. Why?" The girl pressed her lips together. She stared at the tea as if she could find answers in it. "I was afraid for him," she said finally, referring to Raoul. "If I had stayed home, he would have died." "Died of what?" Angela cautiously leaned closer. "Him," Lucia whispered. There was such pain in the girl's eyes that Angela froze for a moment. "Tell me what happened," she asked. Lucia looked at her. "You wouldn't believe me." No one had ever believed me. The story Lucia began to tell was more like a nightmare than real life. Her father, Javier, was a man with strange views on family. After his wife died, he became even more withdrawn. He didn't invite anyone into the house, didn't socialize with anyone. "Sometimes I thought he was afraid of something," Lucia said. "But then I realized that it was us who were supposed to be afraid of him." She remembered one night when she was 8. Her father had come home later than usual. He had a package in his hands. "It was Raoul," she said. He didn't even cry when his father threw him into the crib. Lucia never asked questions for fear of being punished. But deep down she knew, the infant was no ordinary child. "He wasn't fed properly," she continued. "The father said he had to get used to it. Angela felt a chill run down her spine. At this time, Dr. Emilio, who was determined to learn more about Raoul's condition, came across an old box that had been brought in with the baby. There were dirty baby clothes, a few feeding bottles, and a strange paper. Emilio unfolded it and realized it was part of the medical records. But instead of the baby's name, there was only a code, D14. What the hell? He muttered, wiping his glasses. There were strange markings on the chart that looked like medical experiments. Some lines had been crossed out, but still he could make out the phrase, signs of improved tissue regeneration. Emilio felt that the story now went beyond the usual brutality. Meanwhile, Detective Luis continued his conversation with Lucia. You said your father couldn't hurt anyone else, he reminded her. What did you mean by that? The girl bit her lip. He's gone, she said. Gone where? Luis insisted. Lucia looked away. Into the woods. And he left you alone? She nodded. And he didn't come back? No. Her answer was brief, but Luis sensed something was wrong here. You know what happened to your father, don't you? Lucia raised her head. Yes, she said. But you wouldn't believe it. Lucia told how one night her father took Raoul and went into the woods. She didn't know where they were going, but she waited for him to return. It was strange, she said. My father never left me alone for so long. He came back after 3 days. But something was different. His hands were scratched, his clothes were torn. And he never said a word about where he'd been. He became even more violent after that, Lucia said. And Raoul, it was like he was sick all the time. Her words gave Luis a strange feeling. He had seen many cases of violence, but this was something more. The police began to look into what might have happened to Javier. But when detectives arrived at the house, all they found were signs of a struggle, broken furniture and strange marks on the walls. Are those claw marks? One of the officers muttered. Louis frowned. Looks like they are. The detective sensed they were on the cusp of something creepy. Dr. Emilio got the final results of Raoul's tests. It's impossible, he said. What? The nurse asked. He doesn't have normal DNA. It's mutated. While the police were looking for answers, Lucia suddenly said. I have something to show you. She pulled a pendant out of her pocket. My father said it was a key. The key to what? The girl looked at them. To the truth. Everyone in the room looked at the pendant that Lucia held in her small hands. It seemed to be perfectly ordinary, a small metal oval with engraved symbols. But there was something sinister about it that made her heart beat faster. Angela held out her hand. May I see it? Lucia reluctantly handed over the pendant. Father said it's the only thing that can open the way, she added in a whisper. Angela looked at the symbols. One of them, shaped like a zigzag line, resembled an ancient infinity symbol, the other something like an eye. Where did he get that? She asked. I don't know. He always carried it with him, Lucia answered. But when he went into the forest, he left it with me. Angela took the pendant to Emilio. It's strange, he said, looking at the symbols. It's not just jewelry. It looks like it has some kind of technical elements. Are you saying it's a key? She asked. Perhaps. Or a code. But why? At that moment, Emilio remembered the documents with the code D14 that he had found earlier. Could it be related to the experiments? He suggested. While the adults were discussing the pendant, Lucia sat alone in the room. Her gaze was fixed on the window, where the shadows of the trees rippled behind the glass. She closed her eyes, and memories came flooding back. The night her father had gone into the woods with Raoul was the night she remembered most vividly. She saw her father walking down the path, holding the baby in his arms. The moon lit their path, and for a moment she thought someone was following them. All night she waited for his return, but the house was silent. And then she heard a cry, long, drawn-out cry, like that of a wounded animal. It was her father's voice. I saw him through the window, she whispered to herself. He was running back, but something was chasing him. But what it was, she never realized. Meanwhile, Luis returned to Javier's house to take another look at the scene. We missed something important, he told his partner. He noticed strange drawings on the wall of the house. They were made with charcoal or something similar. Luis took some pictures and sent them for analysis. They're symbols, like on the pendant, his partner said. So Javier knew what he was doing, Luis replied. He didn't just go into the woods, he was looking for something or trying to hide from something. Dr. Emilio decided to check out what the code D14 meant. He found documents in the archive that he said shouldn't have existed. It's a project, he said. A secret program involving children. Experimental research. What does this have to do with Raoul? Angela asked. Raoul is part of the experiment, replied Emilio. His DNA had been modified. Angela froze. And Lucia? She could have been a random victim or part of the plan, Emilio pondered. When Lucia heard that she was suspected that she might have been involved, she flared up. It wasn't my fault. She screamed. It's him. Who is he? Angela asked. Father. He said we should be part of something great. But I don't want to. I just want to be normal. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Raoul, he wasn't supposed to be here. His father stole him. Lucia told her that her father came back one night with the baby and told her not to ask questions. He told her that Raoul was special, she said. That he had to be reborn, to be part of the new world. Her words shocked everyone. What new world? Angela asked. Lucia looked at her. A world without people. When Luis returned with the results of the symbol analysis, they matched the symbols on the pendant. It points to an old research center abandoned over 20 years ago, he said. Angela looked at Lucia. Do you know the place? The girl nodded. That's where it all started. The decision to go to the abandoned research center was made quickly. Luis, Angela, Emilio and Lucia realized it was their only chance to find answers. But none of them realized what secrets lurked in this place. We have to be ready for anything, Luis said as he filled his backpack. We could be in trouble. Angela threw him a sharp look. You mean there could be someone out there? I mean there could be something in there. Those words made everyone tense up. Lucia, who was sitting in the corner, clutched her pendant tightly. I remember that place, she said suddenly. I was there, but it was a long time ago. Her confession shocked everyone. When? Angela asked. When Raoul first showed up. My father took us there. He said the place was part of the plan. Those words made everyone hurry up and pack. The journey to the research center took several hours. The car raced along winding roads surrounded by dense forest. Lucia sat in the back seat, looking out the window. "Are you afraid?" Angela asked her. The girl shrugged her shoulders. "I'm afraid we'll find something there that we won't be able to forget." These words silenced everyone. Emilio, sitting in the front seat, scrutinized the map. This place was shut down in the 90s. "There were some experiments here, but the details are classified," he said. "If it's closed, how are we going to get there?" Luis asked. Emilio looked at Lucia. "We have a key." When they arrived at the site, they saw a building that looked more like a fortress. The gray walls, rusty gates, and barbed wire created an atmosphere that sent chills down my spine. "No one lives here," Angela muttered. Louis surveyed the area, holding a flashlight. "It looks like a military facility," he said. Lucia stepped forward. "The entrance is that way," she said, pointing to a side door. Emilio took out a pendant and inserted it into the opening, which turned out to be a lock. The sound of the mechanism opening echoed in the silence of the night. "Inside?" Angela asked. "We have no choice," Luis answered. It was dark inside, broken only by the rays of their flashlights. Old corridors, shabby walls and scraps of wires, this place had clearly been abandoned for decades. "It's like a horror movie in here," Emilio muttered, looking around. Lucia led the way, as if she knew exactly where they were going. "Are you sure you remember where to go?" Angela asked. "Yes. It's in the basement," she answered. With each step, it was getting colder and colder. Symbols began to appear on the walls, like on the pendant. "They're everywhere," Luis remarked. "It's obviously not by accident." Angela touched one of the symbols. "They appear to be hand-carved. Someone has spent a lot of time here." They went down the stairs leading to the basement. The air there was damp and heavy. At the end of the hallway they could see a door labeled D14. "This is it," Emilio whispered. Lucia pulled out the pendant and used it as a key again. The door opened, revealing a huge room. There were screens on the walls, with images of people who looked like Lucia and Raúl. In the center of the room was a large desk covered with files and documents. "This is the lab," Luis said. Emilio walked over to the table and began to study the documents. "Here is everything about the project," he said. D14 is the code name for the program to create. He stopped, his face pale. "What?" Angela asked. "A creature capable of surviving in any environment." Emilio began to read aloud. "Using the DNA of children, we were able to create a life form resistant to disease and time. Subject Raúl is the prototype." Lucia stepped forward. "Does that mean Raúl is not human?" Emilio looked at her. "It means he was created here." Angela felt her heart clench. "What about the children?" she asked. Emilio shook his head. "They were used as Dono." He fell silent, unable to continue. Luis clenched his fists. "That's just horrible. Who would think of such a thing?" Lucia walked silently to the screen where her father's image was. "He knew," she whispered. They continued to explore the room, and Emilio came across an old videotape. "It's all recorded here," he said, inserting the tape into the old player. Javier, Lucia's father, appeared on the screen. If you found this, then I'm already dead. Raoul is the key to survival. But if it falls into the wrong hands, all of humanity will be in danger. Those words shocked everyone. What does that mean? Angela asked. It means that Raoul could be more than just a child, Emilio answered. As they were leaving the room, the lights went out. A strange sound was heard, as if someone or something was moving through the corridors. We're not alone, Luis said as he drew his weapon. Lucia squeezed Angela's hand. He's come for us, the girl whispered. Darkness engulfed the corridors, leaving only the faint light of the flashlights that trembled in Luis and Angela's hands. The shadow continued to approach, its footsteps echoing through the concrete walls. With each sound, the atmosphere thickened like a thick fog. What were those sounds? Angela tried to remain calm, but her voice trembled. It's not an animal, Luis replied quietly, holding his weapon at the ready. Someone or something is watching us. Lucia gripped Angela's hand tighter. The girl was almost out of breath, her eyes full of terror. He's here. I can feel it, she whispered. Emilio stood behind, clutching the documents he had found to his chest. His face was white as chalk. It could be a security system. The lab could have been equipped with something, to protect its secrets, he said, though he could hardly believe his own words. Suddenly the corridor lit up with red light. A siren broke the silence, making everyone grab their ears. Evacuation. D-14 danger level activated, the mechanical voice repeated, as if warning of their fate. We have to get out of here. Luis shouted. The group rushed toward the stairs, but the corridors seemed to change, turning into a maze. The doors through which they had come were now closed, and the walls seemed closer. This is impossible. Angela shouted. We were coming through this corridor. The lab was built to confuse. It's a trap, shouted Emilio, trying to hold the papers in his hands. Lucia stopped suddenly. No, not this way, she said, her voice sounding confident. I know another way out. Are you sure? Luis looked at her, hoping for a miracle. Yes. Follow me. She ran in the opposite direction, pointing down another hallway. They stopped at a door that Lucia opened without the pendant, as if she knew the code. How do you know? Angela asked, but got no answer. The room inside was even more gloomy than the previous ones. On the walls were images of children, their pictures and data. Raoul was in one of the pictures, but there were unnatural shadows behind him. What was going on here? Emilio asked quietly, studying the pictures. This isn't just a lab, Lucia answered. This is where they created the monsters. Luis looked around the walls. He found another monitor that had a video on. Javier appeared on the screen again. If you found this, know this, you have a chance to stop what we started. But be careful. Raoul isn't just a key, he's the final element. He cannot be allowed to leave this place. The words stuck in the air. Luis turned off the monitor. Suddenly, footsteps were heard from the hallway. They were louder now, closer. We need to go, Luis said, checking the clip in his weapon. They ran again, but the shadow was very close. The walls vibrated as if something huge was moving behind them. This way. Lucia pointed to a hatch in the floor. Emilio was the first to dive down, followed by Lucia, Angela, and finally Luis. There was a narrow shaft leading down into the depths below. They moved in total darkness, hearing only their breathing. When they reached the end of the shaft, they found themselves in yet another room. On the floor was a symbol identical to the one on the pendant. "What does it mean?" Angela asked. Lucia looked at the symbol. "It's where it all began," she said. "And perhaps where it will end." Suddenly the door to the room began to open slowly. The shadow they had tried to leave behind was now in front of them. But it was more than they could have imagined. "He found us," Lucia whispered, stepping back. Raoul stood on the threshold. But his eyes were empty and his silhouette was altered beyond recognition. "It wasn't him anymore," Emilio said. The silence of the corridor was broken by the echo of footsteps that came closer and closer. A shadow, barely recognizable in the semi-darkness, moved slowly toward them. Luis picked up the flashlight and pointed the beam of light forward, but neither Angela nor Emilio were sure if they wanted to know who or what it was. "Who's here?" Luis shouted loudly, clutching in his hand the piece of metal pipe he had found earlier. There was no response, only the footsteps became faster. Lucia, not taking her eyes off the approaching shadow, seemed the calmest. This alarmed the others even more. "Lucia, what do you know?" Angela approached the girl, grabbing her by the shoulders. "Are you hiding something?" Lucia didn't take her eyes off the hallway. "It's not him," she whispered. "Who's him?" Emilio asked, turning around abruptly. At that moment a tall figure emerged from the shadows. The man, if he could be called that, moved with unnatural grace. His eyes glittered in the lantern light, and his face seemed to be made up of many scars. "He was part of the project," Lucia said, finally turning to the others. "I remember him. His name was Sergio." "Was he one of those kids?" Luis asked, trying to stay close to Angela and Lucia. Lucia nodded, but her eyes betrayed horror. "He was the first, and the only one who didn't make it." Sergio let out a low ducking sound, and before anyone could react, he lunged forward. The group rushed in different directions, desperately trying to avoid colliding with Sergio. Luis shouted, waving his pipe, but he was moving too fast. "Into the door!" Emilio shouted, pointing to a metal door at the end of the hallway. Angela picked Lucia up and ran after him. Luis lingered, trying to hold Sergio back, but he threw him back against the wall with inhuman strength. Emilio turned around and saw Luis slowly getting up and came back after him. "Are you okay?" he asked, helping his friend up. "Yeah. Come on." The door led to a new room filled with strange glass capsules. Inside them lay figures that looked like sleeping people. Lucia stopped, staring at one of the capsules. "It's them," she whispered. "The rest of the children." "What is this place?" Angela asked, looking around the room. "This is their vault," Emilio said, studying the control panels. "They're not dead, but they're not alive either. They were left here, in case they were needed." Luis, limping, walked over to the control panel. "Can we wake them up?" "I don't think that's a good idea," Emilio answered quickly. Sergio was back in the corridor, and the sound of his footsteps echoed throughout the room. "We need to get out," Luis said. Sergio burst into the room, but this time Lucia stood in front of him. "Sergio, stop!" she shouted. For a moment he froze, his eyes meeting hers. It wasn't a human reaction, but something in his movements became slower. "Do you remember me?" Lucia asked, taking a step forward. Sergio made a sound like a growl, but didn't move. Luis and Angela looked on in horror, not realizing what was happening. Emilio, meanwhile, found a button on the control panel that could shut down the system. "If we press this, everything will stop," he said. "But maybe we'll shut down Sergio too." "Do it!" Angela shouted. Lucia, hearing this, turned around. "No. He just wanted to survive. Just like us." "It's too dangerous, Lucia," Luis said, stepping closer. Sergio started to move toward the control panel, and Emilio, without thinking, pressed a button. The lights in the room flickered, and the pods began to shut down one by one. Sergio let out a long cry and fell to his knees. Lucia rushed to him. "I'm sorry, I couldn't help you," she whispered. His eyes closed and the figure froze. When everything calmed down, the group realized that the lab's system was completely shut down. They stood in silence, realizing that they had closed a chapter that should never have existed. "What now?" Angela asked. "We're going to take this truth with us," Luis said. "And we'll make sure that no one repeats it." Lucia stood up, her gaze focused and hard. "I think he wanted us to realize that this is everything that shouldn't be in the world." They left the research center without looking back.